2044. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Alex, Paul, and John.
Two questions about the eclipse. One, if you have you don't have the storage.
What's you take the really, just the bad side of all this?
No, I'm just, hey, John Tucker. And two, I heard that a lot of drivers, there are a lot of crashes when you have a total eclipse. So they say, like, don't drive when the eclipse is coming and don't pull over because people can crash into you. Like, this is some serious, okay, two warnings.
Wait. How do they crash into you?
Because you can't see.
Well, but that's night.
I don't know, because it happens really fast. I didn't make up the report.
Can you look at it directly? Oh, this is a lunar eclipse. Okay. Solar eclipse, you don't look at it directly.
No, okay. Lordy, no.
Unless you definitely can't do that.
Unless you're the president.
Okay. These are my two questions.
Okay.
Anywho. The other thing I'm looking at here is Larry Fink, BlackRock Chief Executive Officer. He warned of a, quote, looming retirement crisis, I'm so upbeat, facing the U.S. and called on baby boomers to help younger generations save enough for their own future. I mean, but he's not wrong.
No. And this is one of the very few positive things I think that I've imparted to my offspring. Max your 401k. And I can report all three that are employed tell me that they're maxing out on the 401k. And occasionally I'll get the phone call like, wow, this compounding thing really works. And then if it's 2003, they're like, whoa, what's going on here? So, yeah, I think so. But, I mean, I'm going to be working to the day they chuck me in the ground. So nobody's going to be taking care of me. So,
but like my whole financial plan is to set up for retirement. Like that's it. Like it's not to save to buy anything. It's just like, how can I assume I'll not have Social Security,
right,
and just be able to still exist?
You're making that assumption that we're not.
I am.
Okay.
I mean, I probably will, but I'm making an assumption that I won't because I am pretty skeptical. Anyway, Larry Fink and I, he's with me on that retirement crisis. It's happening.
I think he's worried about it.
It's an upbeat Tuesday. He's definitely not worried about it.
Balance of Power coming up right now with Joe Matthew. That's next.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Washington, D.C.
They're rerouting around Baltimore. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as the president prepares to weigh in on the bridge collapse early this morning in Baltimore that is already snarling traffic and trade. We'll have the latest in just a moment on the ground from Bloomberg's Amy Morris, who has been covering this since before the sun came up, and we'll have more on the economic impact with Bloomberg's Brendan Murray straight ahead. The blue wall is looking bluer for Joe Biden. New numbers out in the latest Bloomberg swing state poll. We've got them today with analysis from our signature panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano along for the ride with a lot to cover. Starting, as always, on Wall Street. For that, we turn to midday trading and John Tucker. How's it look, John?
Joe, after a two-day pullback, stocks pushing higher right now. The latest economic readings show consumer confidence holding steady, durable goods orders climbing, home prices accelerating at the fastest rate since 2022. Well, the NASDAQ Composite Index, that right now is on track for another record high if the current gains hold. And Tesla leading gains in mega caps, while Apple underperforming as its iPhone shipments in China fell by a third. In the meantime, Max Kettner of HSBC remains bullish of stocks and credit.
It doesn't pay to be bearish, right? The data is way too good. You've got to stay bullish, and you've got to stay bullish on equities and on high yield in particular.
Well, shares of Donald Trump's social media company jumping on the first day of trading on the NASDAQ. Those shares right now up close to 32%. Overall, S&P 500 up 15 points. That's a rise of 0.3%. 52.33 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 108 points. That's up 0.3%. 39,423 on the index. And the NASDAQ Composite Index 67 points higher. That is up 0.4%. 2-year yield rising up 2 basis points. That's at 4.61. The 10-year, the benchmark, 1 basis point higher. And that is at 4.25. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Balance of Power continues right now with Joe Matthew.
Hey, John, thank you. Great to have you with us today on the fastest show in politics. It's the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, and glad you joined us. This is a big deal, of course, here in the DMV, as we like to call it, the Mid-Atlantic region. But, of course, nationally, there is an impact from this bridge collapse that happened in the wee hours this morning in Baltimore, the Key Bridge. If you're with us on YouTube, we're showing you pictures here, horrifying pictures of what is left at the scene here, a bridge essentially underwater after being struck by a cargo ship that ran out of power, as it turns out, around 1:30 in the morning. This is, of course, a major commuter route and a major trade route there in the Baltimore port. In fact, the #1 port for autos for the past 13 years running. We're learning a lot about the Francis Key Bridge here. The fire chief, James Wallace, briefing reporters earlier in the morning. They have pulled 2 people out of the water. There are as many as 7, from what we understand, they're still looking for. So this is still a rescue operation. Before we start talking about timelines and rebuilding and the rest of it, this is a major test for authorities and for politicians, elected officials in Baltimore and in Maryland. And that's where we start our conversation with Bloomberg Radio's Amy Morris. Amy, I woke up this morning and heard local news coverage that wasn't telling me a lot until I turned to Bloomberg Radio and heard what you were doing with Tom Keene. And I first want to thank you for bringing us the insights that we needed. So much of this has to do with context and the importance of this bridge for the community and for the nation in terms of a trade route is difficult to overstate in this case. Speak to us about what it means for the city.
Let's start from the granular perspective, right? You have 31,000 people who take this bridge every single day. That's 11 million and some change every year. And last night, 31,000 people took this bridge, and this morning, the bridge is gone. They're waking up to no more bridge. And it has been a staple in the Baltimore area for so long. It's part of the landscape. It is a landmark. It's an historic bridge as well. It's been there since 1977. And did you know that its birthday was this past Saturday? It's 47 years old.
Remarkable. It was up to code, according to Wes Moore.
Exactly.
This is not necessarily an infrastructure story. This is an emergency preparedness story. And we're going to, I'm sure, learn a lot more about the communications between that cargo ship. But they did send a Mayday call before they hit the bridge.
They did. And that a small amount of time between that Mayday call and when the bridge collapsed was just enough time for Maryland officials to scramble and keep people from going on the bridge. There were already some people on the bridge, as you mentioned.
Yeah, tell us about that. So there are people then who could have been on the bridge who were stopped. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say, but they would not speak to that at the press conference. But what they did speak to is that there was construction going on the bridge. You know, it's overnight. It's a major highway, so they're going to save all of the road work for when nobody's there. And there were several construction workers filling potholes, handling the concrete on the bridge. They said the bridge was up to code, but they were just, doing a little maintenance. Right. And they went into the water. Yeah.
Tell us about the rescue operation. I referred to as many as 7. Do we have any more detail? We've heard 6 thrown around. Where are we now?
I've heard 6 are still unaccounted for, and those are all the construction crew.
I see.
And we heard a lot about the rescue operation and how it was a big challenge, especially at 1:30 in the morning because it was so dark. You had so many currents. The tide was coming in. And this is an area for people who are not familiar with the Baltimore Bay or the Baltimore Port area. The currents are a big deal. It's a rough area, and especially since this is the river that leads into that port.
Yes.
So that made the search and rescue even that much more difficult.
Great work today, Amy Morris. We're all proud to be working with Amy Morris today at Bloomberg Radio and appreciate your being with us here to get things started on Balance of Power. Our colleague Andrew O'Day, who also lives in the Baltimore area, described this earlier as Baltimore's Golden Gate Bridge. It's difficult without living there to understand the significance of it in the community, and we wanted to start granular with Amy Morris and widening now to talk about the economic impact. As I mentioned, this is the most important port in America for autos. Think of the economic impact on that sector alone. And that's why we wanted to talk with Brendan Murray, who's covering this for us as Bloomberg's trade czar and used to live here in the D.C. Baltimore area. Brendan, it's great to see you. The economic impact, is it possible to quantify yet?
Well, look, this is a port that does about $80 billion in global trade a year. So that works out to about $6.5 billion per month. So, every day it's closed, it's hundreds of millions of dollars of economic impact that are not flowing through this port. These are good jobs, high-paying jobs on the docks and the industrial areas around there. So if maritime traffic and shipping, needs to come to a halt for weeks or months, however long it's going to take, that's going to be a big hit to the folks who work in and around the port.
So shippers like Maersk are saying that they are rerouting now. What are the options available for shippers?
The main ones that the shipping lines are looking at would be New York, New Jersey, Norfolk, the Port of Virginia. There's also Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. Those are also, the big question is which of these other ports can handle the added import of and export of automobiles, like you mentioned, and that's not something that you can do if you don't have the equipment for it, if you don't have the parking lot. The ports that handle a lot of cars have these massive parking lots where the cars sit until they're put on trucks or trains off on their way. So it's not that you can't just turn a ship from Baltimore to any port with a load of cars. That kind of thing has to be worked out pretty well in advance. So it's going to cause some headaches and some congestion for the next several weeks from the people that I talk to until the kind of initial shock of this can be absorbed.
That's for sure. We have to remind ourselves as well, Carnival and Royal Caribbean, 2 cruise lines that use that port actively. We're going to be understanding, I'm sure, over the next 24 to 48 hours exactly how much reach this collapse will have. Brendan, thank you for jumping on with us. Brendan Murray covers this for a living. Our trade czar here with an eye, of course, on the port of Baltimore. We're going to have much more for you on this story throughout the hour. My colleague Kaylee Lyons, who of course you hear every day on this broadcast, has made her way to Baltimore and will bring us live coverage from the scene as soon as she gets set up there, with attention paid to our other major story here in the world of politics, and that is the day of days for Donald Trump. If you were with us yesterday, we got a trial date, of course. We also had a remarkable development in the civil case against Donald Trump. That, of course, questioning the value of his companies as he's presented them, that led to a $454 million penalty, and he has to post bond. An appeals court yesterday brought that bond payment down by about 2/3, making life a lot easier for Donald Trump, especially as he watches his SPAC take off today. This new Digital World's Truth Social thing has put about $3 billion in his bank account, or at least it will when he's able to sell those shares a couple of months down the road. But as we consider the value of Trump Inc. and look at the potential impact on his political career in the throes of a campaign, we wanted to talk to Tim O'Brien, who literally wrote the book on Donald Trump and his finances, of course, the senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion, with us from New York. Tim O'Brien, it's great to see you. I could only imagine what was going through your mind yesterday when that appeals court dropped the bond payment that Donald Trump will have to face. Why is the court going easy on him?
Well, I think, Joe, the appellate court has signaled, I think, that they think the lower court clearly overreached, and that they, I think both in terms of the size of the judgment and possibly in some of the other associated penalties. They also stayed a ruling that kept Trump's 2 eldest sons out of the business, as well as a number of other restrictions that Arthur Engoron, the lower court judge, imposed. So I think that that's a leading indicator, possibly, that they're going to scale back the judgment on appeal. What surprised me was that they did this now as an interim measure. A typical defendant doesn't get that kind of treatment, I think. And Trump had already Trump had these varying, he had these varying accountings of whether or not he could actually pay into escrow the amount of money he needed to essentially collateralize the judgment against him. A year ago under oath, he said he had $400 million in cash on hand, and that was growing substantially each month. And then more recently, he said, I actually don't have the money. And then he took to social media last Thursday and said, actually, I have $500 million. So he's either been lying or very, very forgetful, or he spends money at the speed that some people turn Cuisinarts on and off. Be that as it may, he had demonstrated, I think, that he had, by his own words, that he had the wherewithal to pay the court judgment. So I don't know why the court decided to intercede at this moment in time. That was unusual.
It is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I mean,
wonder
if you and I
might
get
have
a
happened to
parking
you or
ticket, if you and I get a parking ticket and we don't pay it, you know, the fine goes up on a pretty regular basis. So, and
I wonder
is much more than a
if folks are getting nervous. I wonder if folks are getting nervous about the idea of seizing properties. Letitia James had already marked a couple in Westchester County, and it looks like they will not have to be seized now. Does that play into this decision?
Well, I think she probably actually would have seized his entire portfolio because it's so complex. Some of the real estate can't be used as collateral against a bond, so she would have to get, you know, equity in some of these properties. She would have gone for all the low-hanging fruit first, as brokerage accounts, as bank accounts. I don't think his Truth Social stake, as robust as that has become, is something that any kind of surety company would have wanted as collateral, because the value obviously has a great possibility of changing, including going down substantially. So it would have been very complex, and he holds all of this. He's got about 415 or so shell companies under the Trump Organization umbrella, and only 70 of those produce revenue. So anyone attaching assets had a lot of homework in front of them. So I think she would have done a sweeping, undertaken a sweeping effort to get her hands on as much as she could.
You wrote a piece that went up on the 18th of this month that plays into what we're talking about here, Tim. Trump's empty pockets make him an overseas mark. Pretty remarkable when you consider someone who is cash poor, even though they claim to be a billionaire, and the vulnerabilities that might present, the liabilities. What should Americans be watching?
Well, Joe, I think that's been there since he made his first tour through the White House. He has not been shy about trying to monetize the presidency. As we know, when he was running back in 2015 and 2016, he was trying to get a real estate deal done at the same time in Moscow. He pulled in millions of dollars from the hotel that he owned near the White House that was host to foreign dignitaries and emissaries. So that's always lurked around him, and has raised this question of whether or not he's making objective foreign policy decisions, or whether or not someone has their hooks into him. That's even more true now. If he had to scramble to pay big court judgments, which, by the way, he may still have to, even though the fine in this case is, but the bond amount has been reduced, I still think it pressures him, because he's already had to post over, I think, $100 million in the E. Jean Carroll case. And you add, another $200 million to that, I think, I think that significantly cuts into his cash pile. And that raises issues about his ability to operate his company. So that makes him possibly vulnerable to any foreign entity that would like to make a smart investment in a possible future president.
The boom and bust cycle has been a hallmark of Donald Trump's career, I think we can say. And I wonder, just in our remaining moment here, Tim, and I don't want to set you up with some big think question, but just to frame this in our remaining moment, Donald Trump, here he is again on the verge of, bringing in another $3 billion, coming down to the line, almost failing. How does he continue to reconstruct this scenario?
He is both the luckiest man on the face of the earth, and he is also an amazing grifter who is able to, I think, pursue things most people don't without much embarrassment, and he stays in the battle, and he knows right now, I think, that he needs the insulation of the presidency to protect himself from what could be some fairly existential court judgments. This SPAC could not have arrived at a more perfect moment, because otherwise he would have been very financially stressed. Yes.
Isn't that the truth? He's, of course, the author of Trump Nation, but also runs our opinion section on the terminal and at Bloomberg.com. Senior Executive Editor, Bloomberg Opinion, Tim O'Brien. Tim, thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
It's the first name we asked for when we saw this day coming. Appreciate it. Joining us from World Headquarters in New York. Hey, we're just getting started here. We've covered some ground already with Tim, with Amy Morris, of course, as well with Brendan Murray. Thanks to everyone for helping us with the bridge. We're going to have a live report from Baltimore, as I mentioned, from Kaylee before this hour is out. And we'll have our conversation with the panel as well. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are here. New polling data out. We'll talk about it ahead, only on Bloomberg.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg newsroom with his Bloomberg Business Flash. Stocks right now pushing higher. The NASDAQ on track for another record close. In the S&P 500, you have 7 of the 11 major industry groups. They are higher. Consumer discretionary, the best performing group. And that right now is where you're going to find shares of Tesla. They are up 4.3% so far in today's trading. Shares of Apple, they're higher, about 0.1% higher right now. And iPhone shipments in China fell about 33% in February from a year earlier, according to official data. Despite that, as we say, Apple shares are slightly higher. John Lawler, Ford Motors chief financial officer, tells us the automotive supply chain will be disrupted by the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore. And that's just one industry. Right now, the S&P 500, 11 points higher. That's up 0.2%, at 52.29 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, 100 points higher. That is up about 0.3%, 39,413 on the index. And the NASDAQ Composite Index up 45 points. That's a rise of 0.3%. It's 16,428. And we check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Balance of Power continues with Joe Matthew.
Thank you, sir. Good to have John Tucker with us. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Here on the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power. It's only Tuesday. We've already covered a lot of news here in the first 20 minutes. With an eye on Baltimore, I do want to mention here, as we bring you coverage in the way that Bloomberg would, we're looking at, of course, the economic impact, the impact here on life in the Amtrak corridor, never mind the rescue operation that is, of course, underway. We're still looking for 6 people, construction workers, who were on the Key Bridge when it came down at 1:30 in the morning, having been struck by a cargo ship. We're going to hear from Joe Biden soon. And when he speaks, we'll, of course, bring you the president's remarks live on Bloomberg Radio and on YouTube. Currently scheduled to begin about 7 minutes from now, but this has been a fluid situation. The president heading to North Carolina today was expected to speak about an hour ago, but they moved the remarks to this hour. Again, we'll bring them to you when we get there, and we'll have a lot more on the bridge over the course of the program. Big deal today that we've been talking about with our buddy Nathan Dean for months and months. It actually came to fruition in the form of an important settlement. Visa and MasterCard agreeing to cap credit card swipe fees, and what we are framing as one of the most significant antitrust settlements ever. Nathan is with us now. It's good to see you from Bloomberg Intelligence. This has been something important to Joe Biden. We talk about fees and eliminating junk fees and so forth, but a huge deal for the credit card industry that didn't want any part of this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a $30 billion settlement, and obviously from Visa and MasterCard's standpoint, they've agreed to temporarily, through 2030, reduce the amount of caps, which is on what's called credit card interchange fees. So this is actually fees. A lot of this is going to the banking industry. So the banks are not going to be happy about this. Now, the reason why Washington is involved here also is because Senator Dick Durbin from Illinois has this bill out there called the Credit Card Competition Act. And this is part of the junk fee proposal from the Biden administration, the junk fee executive order and all this talk about additional competition and so forth to try and lower these fees even more. Now, what I think will happen here is I don't think Senator Durbin is going to give up on his act because of this. You know, this is, like I said before, only goes through 2030. Okay. And while the $30 billion is significant, it doesn't structurally change that Visa and MasterCard dominate the network for this. I think, however, what this will do is maybe make it a little bit harder for additional supporters to come on board, because, you know, anybody who's been following this issue, or if anybody has a credit card that is using airline miles, you know that these reward programs could be at risk if this bill goes forward. And I just still think when you put an issue against the retailers, against the banks, against YouTube travelers and vloggers, you know, I think this is something that Congress just doesn't know what they want to do yet.
Well, that's going around, isn't it? I mean, I could name any issue on the to-do list and you could answer it almost the same way. Having funded the government, apparently at great peril to the Speaker of the House, there's a question about what else could happen this year. The tax deal that was struck between the House and Senate appears to be on ice. And then there's Ukraine, and that might be the answer after Easter based on what we're hearing from the Speaker.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Speaker Johnson said that, you know, he is committed to putting a vote to some form of Ukraine aid, not obviously the Senate deal that was put through earlier. You know, we've talked about on this program before this idea of an interest-free loan that President Trump has somewhat backed. But then comes the question of the motion to vacate and whether or not Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to eventually move through, you know, with this motion to vacate if Speaker Johnson moves to the floor with Ukraine aid. So I think they're on a 2-week recess right now. After Easter, they'll come back. I think some form of Ukraine aid will make it to the floor. Representative McCall said this just yesterday that he thinks some form of it will come. But I think the next 2 weeks for Speaker Johnson is trying to float out a pathway to avoid this motion to vacate. Because even though we've had Democrats say that they would be willing to help the Speaker, that comes with a price tag.
Not making that bet.
And,
sure.
Yeah, and obviously a Republican Speaker of the House doesn't want to have his job just because of Democrats from New York, you know, backing you up here.
Don't make me have to do this, guys.
Exactly.
AOC said it best maybe on Sunday morning. Yeah, we'll help them out, but we're not doing it for free.
Exactly.
So what would be the cost? Is it a power sharing agreement that would essentially leave the speaker with no authority?
No, I don't think it will go that far because, if he does need Democratic votes, we're only talking a handful. I mean, we're not talking like a large amount here. I think a commitment to bringing Ukraine aid and Israel aid to the floor by a certain time could get a lot of those folks on board. But again, the optics are bad. But when it comes to the rest of the year, I hate saying this to clients because November is so long away, but April is Ukraine. You've got May, June, a little bit of July. They're out for August. They're out for October. September will be another CR fight. There's not a lot of time left to get other stuff done. It's going to be really interesting to see how much time this Ukraine package takes because there's a whole host of other smaller legislation out there like crypto and stable coins and the tax bill that you were talking about that's just waiting for this to get resolved.
And may never see the light of day, I guess, in this Congress. But how are we looking at this motion to vacate? Marjorie Taylor Greene, okay. You didn't go to the floor. You didn't make that a privileged resolution. So are we not just raising money here? I realize she says Ukraine is the hook. But if you're Speaker Mike Johnson, don't you call the bluff?
Speaker Johnson has called the bluff several times before, and he's still Speaker.
That's right.
Obviously things can always change. And, a motion to vacate fight, Speaker Johnson knows, is not something the Republican Party wants to have 5-6 months before the elections. So if I'm Speaker Johnson, it's all about flexibility and options and trying to avoid that motion to vacate because there is no good solution that comes from that, even if he keeps his job. You're either going to keep your job through Democrat support or it's just going to be another few weeks of us watching C-SPAN trying to figure out who's going to be the next speaker. Nothing good comes from that. So if I'm Speaker Johnson, I'm going to feel things out, try and keep all options open, potentially see if I can get President Trump on my side. If I go with President Trump's interest-free loan deal, would Marjorie Taylor Greene do a motion to vacate on something President Trump supports?
Well, these are great questions. Could that actually emerge in legislative form? Is that what could be cooked up in this recess?
I think it's one of the options. I mean, the easiest option would be to take the Senate bill, tweak it, send it back to him. But, I think that Speaker Johnson is just looking at a lot of different things right now. Representative McCall, even just said yesterday that he's had conversations. Lindsey Graham has said that he's had conversations on this. So I think, honestly, what's happening right now is, you talk with the Ukraine aid, and for the investment portfolio, remember, most of this aid is going to go to U.S. defense contractors and so forth like that. But you talk with the idea that we think Ukraine aid will get done. We do think it's going to be a multi-billion-dollar package deal. But the question is the details, the semantics, and how it gets through. But I do think it will happen in April.
Yeah. We're spending time with Nathan Dean from Bloomberg Intelligence as we wait to hear from President Obama. We have our eyes on the Roosevelt Room right now in the White House where the podium has been set up. Reporters will be in position here when the president decides to speak. We'll bring remarks live here specific to the bridge collapse earlier today in Baltimore. We spent so much time talking about infrastructure in the first 2 years of Joe Biden's tenure here as president, and it turns out this really is not an infrastructure story. This bridge was up to code, according to Wes Moore. So you wonder to what extent there's a Washington angle here beyond simply funding local governments.
Well, I think it's going to be our federal funds deviated to help with this bridge. I mean, I was looking at some of the, and I can't remember if it was the Bush administration or if it was the Clinton administration, but I was reading a story this morning on Bloomberg about how there was a bridge collapse, and within 3 days, Congress had already deviated $250 million via unanimous consent through the Senate to replace that. So, don't be surprised. I don't think anything's going to move that quickly because they're on recess. But, infrastructure is something that, I think this is going to be a wake-up call for a Biden second term, if you will, because there's so many bridges that have to be replaced. I mean, you have the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that went through the Bipartisan Act. Then you have the Inflation Reduction Act. So there was, remember, every week here was Infrastructure Week.
Absolutely.
There are so many bridges that need to be replaced in the United States, and obviously this was not bad code or anything like that. it wouldn't be surprised to see another round at trying to get a little bit more infrastructure money in his second Biden term.
And then you're going to hear from Republicans who said, we told you we needed more for roads, bridges, and tunnels. So, a lot of that bill went to broadband internet, a lot of things.
Yeah, and like with any infrastructure bill, there's a price tag and it'll come down, and there's inflationary aspects that you have to think about. So I'm not saying this is going to happen, but I could see that this could be the rolling of a certain momentum that in a second Biden term.
I think it's really smart.
Let's do the, it's like the highway bill. The highway bill that comes out every few years. It doesn't really get to the point where I can talk about it on Bloomberg Radio, but it's also very important because it's tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars that flow out. And as a remember, for any investor who's watching this, the most important companies that comes to any type of infrastructure deal are mom and pop companies. It's not the high publicly traded firms, like the John Deere's and the so forth. They get the downfall impact a couple of years later, but it's these mom and pop companies out in Peoria, Illinois and Topeka, Kansas that are the ones that get the contracts for building those roads and building those bridges. And then on an 18-month to 2-year cycle, they'll buy equipment to deal with that. So if there is an infrastructure bill, and again, it's a long, I'm talking years from now or 2 years from now, if there is an infrastructure bill and you're trying to figure out how to plan for your publicly traded portfolio, it's usually a 2-year.
This is fascinating. I think we're going to play this tape back. Infrastructure 2.0. If Joe Biden gets reelected, it makes an enormous amount of sense. He sees it as the great accomplishment of his first term, and it plays well. He always makes the joke out there. Those Republicans are happy to take the money even though they voted against it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anybody who's driven on a highway, even under the Bush administration, you can remember those signs saying paid for by, this infrastructure deal. And look, everybody knows a bridge. Everybody knows a road. And, obviously, there's a human element to the bridge collapse today.
Of course.
But for the folks that use that bridge for commuting, they're going to see fairly quickly how that's going to change. And like we saw earlier this year in Philadelphia, how quickly policymakers came together to fix the bridge in Philadelphia.
That's right.
It's good politics.
And actually managed to innovate while they were at it. And you wonder if that's what we're going to be in for here. Waiting to hear from Joe Biden is going to be speaking to this bridge collapse in just a moment from the White House. Unclear if he'll take questions. He's on his way out of town. He's going to be back on the road today to North Carolina, likely, by the way, Nathan, talking about his accomplishments, including infrastructure. It is amazing how this stuff just keeps coming around.
Yeah, the one thing I will say, though, is that infrastructure comes, there's this discussion, but if President Trump wins in November, we think the Inflation Reduction Act is safe. However, there are a lot of green energy tax credits in there that could be at risk. And so if you're exposed to the solar industry, for example, my colleague Rob Barnett has a lot of notes out there talking about how solar, like for solar, and so for example, a lot of their long-term earnings are baked onto this idea that
they're booked because of the IRA.
Exactly. So, two scenarios I think could play out if President Trump wins. The first one is they just try and repeal. Now, I think that's easier said when you're not in power, but when you are in power, it's going to be harder because, like you said before, a lot of Republican districts are getting money from the Inflation Reduction Act.
Hard to claw back.
However, President Trump could, if on his first day, decide to do an executive order that tweaks a lot of the tax incentives because the IRA was $500 billion in new spending, but there was a lot of tax incentives that the IRS and the Treasury Department could start tweaking immediately. So, from an infrastructure perspective, that clean energy aspect could be, I don't want to say at risk, but at risk of change.
Fascinating.
If President Trump wins in November.
So we get closer. Polls show this being Trump's race to lose. Keep your eye on First Solar shares.
I would say the energy policy in particular, because
EV makers,
EV makers, and so forth like that, and a lot of it's going to be on the regulatory side. So it's not going to be an immediate change. If President Trump puts out an executive order on day one, 90% of those executive orders will be directing his agencies to do something, and that takes 12 to 18 months, if not longer. I don't think there'd be an immediate impact, but energy is certainly one of those sectors to watch.
To do something or undo something, as the case may be. It's great to see you, Nathan. Thank you, as always. Always my great pleasure to spend time with Nathan Dean at Bloomberg Intelligence. We are his client here on Balance of Power, just like those who use the terminal. Find him on the terminal, BI, and at Bloomberg.com. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, D.C. My colleague, Kaylee Lyons, who would normally be sitting next to me on this broadcast, helping you to bring these stories, has made her way to Baltimore And I understand she might be joining us right now, as a matter of fact. No? All right, we're going to do that a little bit later on as Rick Davis joins us, Bloomberg Politics contributor. Standing by to hear from Joe Biden. The stage is set here in the Roosevelt Room. Rick, we've got the podium up. Reporters are in place. What does Joe Biden say about something like this? Is it a consoler-in-chief type of conversation, knowing that there are 7 potentially souls still unaccounted for here, or does this turn to policy?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both, but I think it's really all about, the president taking action, responding to these kind of crises. He's been criticized in the past to not put his own imprimatur on crisis reaction. And so I'm sure the people in the White House, the executives there, were very sensitive to a major incident like this and not making it look like the president wasn't taking personal control over this crisis. He's a guy known for a lot of investment in infrastructure, so he'll have something to say about the $1 trillion that he's already gotten appropriated for infrastructure and why that's so important. He'll talk about, I'm sure, the supply chain and how these kinds of incidents could have a really significant impact on the supply chain. We've heard all morning about the millions of cars a year that go through this port. And other kinds of things. All you have to do is look at the news and see the container ship that hit the bridge full of containers on the way out. So whatever those things were aren't going to make the market on time. And so I think that the real key here, though, is Joe Biden's going to try and convince the American people that he can manage a crisis and that he'll do it personally and that he can, be competent in that execution. How long is it going to take to get that river cleared? How long is it going to get the port back into operation? How long is it going to take to get a bridge built? I mean, all those things people are going to start asking questions about, and the president's going to have his fingerprints on that.
This is a test for the president. It's a test, of course, for Governor Wes Moore, and it's a test for all of those involved in this search and rescue operation right now. And that's where we find Bloomberg's Kayleigh Lines, my partner here on Balance of Power, has made her way north from Washington to Baltimore, and now at that scene where they are staging this effort. Kayleigh, just tell us off the top what you saw when you got there.
Well, pretty incredible as we were driving in, Joe, to see just a bridge that is no longer even there. Essentially, it's a road to nowhere, as there are parts of this bridge that have completely collapsed after this ship, the Dolly, ran into one of the structural supports of this bridge. And even coming in here to the port, you can see the thousands of new automobiles that are lining parking lots. This, of course, being a port that handles the most in terms of cars and light trucks in the United States, almost 850,000 of them last year alone. And this is one of the ways in which transport could be seriously disrupted of cars and other goods as a result of this incident. But of course, right now in real time, first and foremost, the priority of Maryland officials is this search and rescue mission. We heard that from Governor Wes Moore earlier today. He was talking about how saving lives remains their exclusive focus today. They will get toward reopening the port reconstruction efforts later, but right now it is still about rescuing these individuals that are still unaccounted for, keeping in mind, Joe, that we do know there was a construction crew present on the bridge at the time of this collision and collapse. 2 individuals were rescued, one of which is in the hospital, but 6 others still have not been found at this point.
Pretty remarkable, Kayleigh. We do have news from the White House. The president's going to emerge in just a moment, so I don't want to cut you off, Kayleigh. But when you're looking out from your vantage point, basically the entire 1.5-mile long bridge is underwater.
Yeah, exactly, Joe. The bridge that once stood here does not stand here any longer. And you heard the words of Governor Wes Moore when he was addressing how shocking this is for anyone in Maryland or who has transited this bridge before to just think that the Key Bridge is no longer a bridge that is, helping gap a divide on I-695. He was talking about how 35,000 individuals every day crossed this 1.5-mile stretch of road, 11 million plus vehicles per year. And now all of that traffic, of course, is going to have to be diverted elsewhere to I-95 or I-895, for example. And it begs the question of just how long this reconstruction effort might take. Of course, the governor did not put a timeline on that this morning, but we expect that the White House, of course, will be heavily involved in this project. We've already heard about talking of emergency funds being released, questions about what infrastructure money could be unlocked as well. And of course, we very well could get answers to that, not just from President Biden, but from the Transportation Secretary, Pete Buttigieg, who is expected to be here later today at the invitation of Governor Moore.
I'm just going to ask you that, Kaylee. That's a really important detail. The administration then is going to be on the ground on this first day?
Yes, we are expecting that Pete Buttigieg will arrive here at some time to coordinate the efforts that are underway with Maryland authorities, including Maryland's own Secretary of Transportation, as well as Governor Moore. The question is really around what is going to happen after today. Is really already Maryland first responders have been here trying to undergo this search and rescue effort, recover those individuals who are still unaccounted for. But then what role the federal government will play in conjunction with the state as we talk about opening up this really vital transit way is going to be an evolving conversation, of course, Joe, as we move forward. And of course, we'll keep you updated here on Bloomberg Radio and on television and all of our other platforms when we do hear from the Transportation Secretary.
Just lastly, Kaylee, what's the response like? I suspect you've got a lot more than local media in that staging area.
Oh, there are hundreds of media here, I would venture, Joe. It's quite a busy scene. Of course, you do have the local media, as again, this broader DMV area has been very shaken by this incident. This is a very popular commuter transit way that we are talking about here, but there are other representatives from national media as well, because of course it is not just a local issue, it is really a national issue. In terms of local and commuter traffic, of course, that is where it's going to be felt very acutely for the people who are using this bridge each and every day, but it could have national implications to the north in places like New York, and the south to places like Norfolk, where there are other large ports that may now have to compensate for the cargoes that can no longer ship in and out of this waterway, for all of that traffic that is being diverted, and for a country that, of course, like many parts of the world, had been roiled in terms of supply chain infrastructure during the pandemic and still in many ways trying to recover and recuperate from that. You could feel some of those supply chain squeezes once again. So what happened at 1:30 a.m. this morning when the ship struck this bridge, of course, could have ramifications beyond just those individuals who, of course, were tragically affected by this accident and those that are here in the region, but it could have much wider ripple effects as well.
That's for sure. Kaylee Lines, thank you, Kaylee. Come back and let us know what's up next hour here. My co-anchor here on Balance of Power, Bloomberg's Kaylee Lines, at the scene in Baltimore where this bridge collapsed at around 1:30 a.m. We're expecting to hear from Joe Biden any moment now. He was, in fact, scheduled to speak about 15 minutes ago. Knowing he is leaving town, we thought that might be a bit more prompt, but obviously there are a lot of moving parts here. We do have the Roosevelt Room lit and ready for the president at the White House when he decides to speak. I'm sure he's talking with a lot of people before he comes out today. To Rick Davis's point earlier, in the effort to appear to be an action-oriented president here, you don't just speak for nothing, and he's got to do more than talk about the infrastructure law that he signed, because this bridge was up to code, according to Wes Moore, the governor of Maryland, who Kaylee referred to there. Also important to note, as Kaylee just brought to us, the Transportation Secretary, Pete Buttigieg, will be on the scene later. You can expect to see him all over screens in the second half of the day, and I suspect he'll be doing interviews from there tomorrow morning. This is me speculating, but this has been the playbook for this administration, as you would expect in a time like this. Remembering, this is still a search and rescue operation, looking for 6 people now at this point who were on that bridge, construction workers who have gone missing since the collapse. There was a Mayday call that was sent from the cargo ship when it lost power, and it was suggested, at least by Wes Moore, that lives may have been saved, as they did try to restrict access to that bridge when the Mayday call went out, with this ship careening toward the pylon that took the bridge down. But of course, people were already on the span when it happened. And that is why this has been such a tragic story. If you're with us on YouTube, welcome. We're showing you images live from the scene now, from above and from the ground where Kaylee is. If you're with us on the radio, we'll continue to paint the picture for you. And at 1 p.m., just about 15 minutes from now, we'll bring our global television audience into the fold here on Balance of Power for a lot more. Let's bring you to the White House now. Live remarks from Joe Biden from the White House on Bloomberg.
Which we're doing in a few minutes. I want to speak briefly about the terrible incident and accident that happened in Baltimore this morning. At about 1:30, a container ship struck the Francis Scott Key Bridge, which I've been over many, many times commuting from the state of Delaware in our train or by car. I've been in Baltimore Harbor many times. And the bridge collapsed, sending several people and vehicles into the water, into the river. And multiple U.S. Coast Guard units, which are stationed very nearby, thank God, were immediately deployed along with local emergency personnel. And the Coast Guard is leading the response to the port, where representatives from the Federal Highway Administration, the FBI, Department of Transportation, the Army Corps of Engineers, as well as Maryland officials and Baltimore Police and Fire. They're all working together to coordinate an emergency response. Officials at the scene estimate 8 people were unaccounted for still. Not still, were unaccounted for. That number might change. 2 have been rescued, 1 without injury, 1 in critical condition. And the search and rescue operation is continuing for all those remaining as we speak. I spoke with Governor Moore this morning, as well as the Mayor of Baltimore, the county executive, both United States senators and the congressman. And my Secretary of Transportation is on the scene. I told them we're going to send all the federal resources they need as we respond to this emergency. And I mean all the federal resources. And we're going to rebuild that port together. Everything so far indicates that this was a terrible accident. At this time, we have no other indication, no other reason to believe there's any intentional act here. Personnel on board the ship were able to alert the Maryland Department of Transportation that they had lost control of their vessel, as you all know and reported. As a result, local authorities were able to close the bridge to traffic before the bridge was struck, which undoubtedly saved lives. Our prayers are with everyone involved in this terrible accident and all the families, especially those waiting for the news of their loved one right now. I know every minute in that circumstance feels like a lifetime. You just don't know. It's just terrible. We're incredibly grateful for the brave rescuers who immediately rushed to the scene, and to the people of Baltimore. I want to say we're with you. We're going to stay with you as long as it takes. And like the governor said, you're Maryland tough, you're Baltimore strong, and we're going to get through this together. And I promise we're not leaving. Here's what's happening now. The search and rescue operation is our top priority. Ship traffic in the Port of Baltimore has been suspended until further notice, and we'll need to clear that channel before the ship traffic can resume. The Army Corps of Engineers is on the spot and is going to help lead this effort to clear the channel. The Port of Baltimore is one of the nation's largest shipping hubs, and I've been there a number of times as a senator and as a vice president. It handles a record amount of cargo last year. It's also the top port in America for both imports and exports of automobiles and light trucks. Around 850,000 vehicles go through that port every single year, and we're going to get it up and running again as soon as possible. 15,000 jobs depend on that port, and we're going to do everything we can to protect those jobs and help those workers. The bridge is also critical for travel, not just for Baltimore, but for the Northeast Corridor. Over 30,000 vehicles cross the Francis Scott Key Bridge on a daily basis. It's virtually, it's one of the most important elements for the economy in the Northeast and the quality of life. My transportation secretary is there now. As I told Governor Moore, I've directed my team to move heaven and earth to reopen the port and rebuild the bridge as soon as humanly possible. And we're going to work hand in hand with the support of Maryland to support Maryland whatever they ask for. We're going to work with our partners in Congress to make sure the state gets the support it needs. It's my intention that the federal government will pay for the entire cost of reconstructing that bridge, and I expect the Congress to support my effort. This is going to take some time. The people of Baltimore can count on us, though, to stick with them at every step of the way until the port is reopened and the bridge is rebuilt. You know, we're not leaving until this job gets done. Not leaving until then. So I just want to say God bless everybody who got everyone harmed this morning and their families. And may God bless the first responders, many of whom risked their lives. And the reason I'm not going to take a lot of questions, there's remaining issues that are open, and we got to determine what's going to happen in terms of the rescue mission and the like. But
Do you plan to go to Baltimore, sir? And if so, how quickly?
I do, and as quickly as I can.
You said the federal government's also going to pay for the repairs. I'm just curious, this was a ship that appears to be at fault. Is there any reason to believe that the company behind the ship should be held responsible? And then also, you mentioned...
That could be, but we're not going to wait for that to happen. We're going to pay for it to get the bridge rebuilt and open.
What did you make of Israel's decision not to attend this meeting this week?
Oh, I don't want to get into that. We've plenty of time to talk about Ross.
You mentioned the port. Can I ask about cars? About the port.
Joe Biden making his way out of the Roosevelt Room here after some brief remarks following the bridge collapse this morning in Baltimore. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for being with us here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. With the line of the day from the president here, the federal government will pay in full for the rebuilding of this bridge. That, as you just heard, prompted questions about what if the fact that this shipping line was at fault. We, of course, know that a Mayday call did go out. We know that ship lost power before it careened into the bridge, bringing down this 1.5 mile long span, the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore. That, of course, straddling the port of Baltimore, the busiest for autos in the nation. And so there are several different storylines here that we're following, beginning with the search and rescue operation. There are 6 people unaccounted for right now. A massive bridge underwater in Maryland. And, of course, the economic impact that we are now going to get our arms around that the president was trying to get ahead of here. Let's assemble our panel. An important day to have both Rick Davis with us here, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Republican strategist, joined by Brad Howard, now at the Corcoran Street Group, which he founded, Democratic strategist. Gentlemen, great to have both of you with us here. Rick, we spoke briefly before the president hit the podium. How did he do? And was that the promise that he should have made?
Yeah, I think he hit all the marks that we talked about. He looked in control. He looked like he cared about what was going on in Baltimore. He offered 100% federal aid. That was much more than I would have thought he would have said. I think this was the White House leaning in on a crisis. And so I think he hit the marks that he wanted to, showed he cared, and wouldn't be surprised to me that this becomes a Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. bridge someday.
I bet you like the sound of that, Brad Howard. What do you think of this promise for starters? The federal government will pay to rebuild that bridge in full. Is that the right message today?
Yeah, and I'm based on what I just heard, it sounds like he says we're not going to wait on any potential legal challenge. We're going to start investing right away in not only the cleanup but the future rebuild. So I think the option is still open to go after the company to pay, reimburse the government. But as you know, legal challenges like this, it's going to take a while to figure out what happened. And then, of course, the court case. And I've been in touch with my contacts within the Biden administration this morning about this tragic disaster. And this is going to be a very complicated situation we're facing, because we're not just talking about vehicular traffic being blocked. The harbor now is full of debris. And so these ships, these container ships cannot traverse the Baltimore harbor, which is one of the busiest in the world. And so essentially the port of Baltimore is going to be closed for some time. That's a huge problem. And it's going to exacerbate some of our supply chain issues as well. Like the Secretary Buttigieg is heading down there today, from what we understand. The FBI is going to investigate what happened here along with the NTSB. And so there's going to be some time to really kind of figure out what's happening. And as we should, the focus is going to be on the search and rescue mission. But this is when experience matters. And so I think this is going to be a reminder to the American people that Joe Biden, yes, he's old, but he's experienced. And that's where this is going to help, because this is a lot of intergovernment coordination that's going to be required here. And a president who is experienced, and with the legislature, he has not to mention, he's going to rely on Congress to help pay for some of this. So this is where Joe Biden really does have a chance to shine.
Pete Buttigieg is on his way to the scene. Rick, I'm sure you're going to see him all over the place in news coverage later on. Based on what we just heard from Brad, does Joe Biden need to go himself? Remember the calls for him to show up in Palestine, Ohio, following the train derailment there? He showed up, I think, a year later, though Pete Buttigieg was there that day. The NTSB was there within 24 hours, and the president was still criticized for it. Does he need to go himself?
Yeah, and Secretary Buttigieg is a man on the scene even today, but he's staff, even as a cabinet secretary. The principal is Joe Biden, and it wouldn't surprise me that Joe Biden would want to make an appearance here soon. He has always deferred to not going to these kinds of scenes right away, because the arrival of a president is a disruptive event to people doing search and rescue and things like that. And I would be surprised if that changes in this context. But my guess is they're not going to make the mistake they made in previous disasters where they hold him back too long. And I would certainly, if I were a Democrat looking at this situation, want to see the president show leadership, show strength, show commitment to the people of Baltimore and to the nation, because this really is a national disaster. This can affect the entire country, as we've been talking about this morning. So, yeah, I mean, I can't imagine a scenario where within very short period of times, once the search and rescue process is probably completed, he wouldn't show up.
Mm-hmm. I want to just let our audience know that we're preparing to hear a special interview with my colleague David Weston, who's sitting down with the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink. That's just a couple of moments from now, something that we've been looking forward to today. Brad, do you agree should Joe Biden get up to Baltimore? It's kind of in the neighborhood.
Absolutely. And like, you know, Baltimore's a little different than East Palace. That was a chemical disaster. So I think there was, you know, concern. Like, you know, I do think he waited too long to get there. In particular, so did Secretary Buttigieg. So they've certainly learned their lesson on how to respond to these situations. So, you know, Secretary Buttigieg, I don't think they waited an hour to decide to get him there. And I'm sure the president will come when it's safe to do so. It doesn't affect the search and rescue, which again is the priority right now, not politics.
Yeah, and by the way, I'm not sure that was fair criticism. What the heck is Joe Biden going to do in East Palestine that he can't do in the Oval Office? It's probably the opposite, actually, when you're taking him out of the loop. But so much of this has to do with optics. Yes. Rick Davis, Nathan Dean was here just a moment ago talking about the potential if Joe Biden were reelected for an infrastructure 2.0. Does a day like this, even though that bridge was up to code, we have a lot of bridges that are not. Does a day like this make that more likely?
You know, it's hard to tell. I mean, we've been through so many decades of infrastructure setbacks, and we finally got $1 trillion into the pipeline. It's going to take a long time for that money to actually make an impact. Obviously, they focus on shovel-ready projects initially, but I think, you know, it's a 5-year program of spending, and you'd have to make a pretty solid case to want to go back and create enough spending to make it worthwhile, $500 billion, 300, 400 billion. And then you'd have to worry about whether or not that has a inflationary impact. So I think there are a lot of other priorities in a second Biden administration. And going back to sort of the tried and true infrastructure would surprise me that Congress would actually support that, because they've just done the biggest infrastructure package in history. Right. And, you know, why go back to that well so quickly?
Rick Davis and Brad Howard, great to have both of you with us. We're going to hear more from our panel next hour. And we'll also connect with Bloomberg's Kayleigh Lyons once again, who is in Baltimore at the scene of the bridge collapse. And we'll have her report coming up as well. Something very special to begin our second hour on Bloomberg TV and radio, an interview from my colleague David Weston with BlackRock CEO Larry Fink in what is a special edition of Bloomberg Wall Street Week Daily. We'll have more on the other side, including reaction from our panel here on Balance of Power. Now to Rick Davis. Make that David Weston on Bloomberg.
For our Bloomberg audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. We're delighted to be joined right now by BlackRock Chairman and CEO Larry Fink. So, Larry, welcome. It's good to have you here on the day of your annual Chairman's Letter to the investors. And it's a bit of a different, I think, letter from what you've done before. Personal. Starts with your parents. Right. And they're saving for retirement. Yeah. And includes your grandkids as well. Yes. The retirement crisis. Give us your diagnosis of that problem right now.
Well, it's something I've been writing about for years. But I emphasize it in this letter. And, you know, all my letters have been based on some long-term issues. And let me be really truthful about my letters. My letters are a reflection of my conversations with clients. So it is, and so over the past year, I heard more and more conversation about retirement, the retirement crisis, from many parts of the world, from middle-class developing countries to developed countries. The acute problem here in the United States is that we have still 57 million Americans who don't have any savings or any retirement plan. Social Security is a fantastic foundation for retirement, but if that's all you have when you retire, you're going to be living in poverty, below the poverty line, because it just is not, it's supplemental, but it's not meant to be the totality of what you have in a retirement. And the whole concept of we're aging, we're all living longer. And I think one of the big narratives I've had to reflect in 2023 was the miracles of medicine. When we talk about the drugs like Ozempic and all the different weight loss drugs, how that is extending life. It's conquering kidney disease and liver disease and heart disease and joint disease. And then there are new medicines now for dementia that extends life. So if you think about the miracles of technology and how it transforms our lives and extends our life, there is not a dialogue in America or most places about can we afford that longevity. And our entire retirement system was based on statistics that were created 50 years ago, whereby most Americans retired between 60 and 62 then, but most Americans then passed away at 67. And today, statistically, a couple 60 years old in good health, one of them is going to live over 90. And so the other question is, should we reevaluate how we work and how long we work? Because we all need purpose in life. And in most people find purpose, obviously, maybe with their grandchildren, their children, their community. Many people find purpose in their jobs. And the thought of retiring at 60 with 30 more years or a 30-year life in front of you, we need to have a dialogue. We need to have a conversation. And, I'm an optimist. I am very optimistic about the long-term vitality of our markets. I'm bullish on capitalism. Right. The reason why I'm bullish is that when I read the newspapers every morning and listen to Bloomberg and other news organizations, it's full of scary things. We talk about the problems. Yeah. We talk about all the problems in life. But we solve problems through conversation. Right. And the one area where we have no conversation is the affordability of retirement and the whole concept of retirement. And we need to start a global and, most importantly, a national dialogue.
So in your letter, you have a very powerful, I think, diagnosis of the problem, not just the United States, but globally.
Yes.
We're living longer. We need more money, therefore, to live. At the same time, there's also a bit of a pain there to capitalism, and particularly capital markets, and the extraordinary things they've done, what they can do. Connect the two of those up. Could we use the capital markets to address at least some of the problem we're talking about? And let me be very specific. Social Security, you mentioned, is really in trouble. Should we be taking the Social Security Trust Fund, what's left of it, and put it into capital markets?
We need to put it in a long-term investment. I mean, we have a system of pay-as-you-go. Okay, there are other countries like Australia that have a whole unique system whereby you're contributing. But right now in Congress, there are a number of senators and congressmen are talking about rehabilitating our Social Security pool and maybe contributing a big block of money into it so it has sufficiency. But to me, as I said, Social Security is just a foundation of retirement. We need to really educate our citizens about the need for savings. We see worldwide, most people who are really thrifty, they keep most of their money in a bank account. Like in Japan, there's a high savings rate of 18%. Most of that is in a bank account. In Europe, there's a high savings rate of 15-ish%. Most of that's in a bank account. That is not going to provide you with the adequacy of the compounding of what capital markets can do. But probably one of the big conversations I've had with so many political leaders is the connection of retirement and the capital markets. When you think about the vitality of the U.S. capital market, so much it's based on the long-term money of pension funds, of our, whether it's a defined benefit plan or a defined contribution plan. And Americans are more optimistic, and so we have a higher investment in equities beyond any other society. And so in my conversation with many political leaders, as they think about retirement, and Japan is a great example, the Kishida government just this past October raised the amount of tax deductibility to put in your 401k. They doubled the size. And it's not a coincidence that the Japanese equity market since October is up 30%. And it's because we're seeing more and more money that is going into the long-term capital markets. So not only does it give financial returns for those who are retiring and saving for retirement, but it's a big foundation for domestic companies to have local investing in your own companies. If you look at the United States, our our equity markets generally traded at 2 to 3 PE ratio higher than any place in the world. Now, you could argue we have better companies than any other place in the world, but you could also have to attribute this to that we have a larger retirement system in terms of what we invest in. Now, that doesn't mean we need more. We need more money for more people to be putting it into their system.
Take it a step further, because something you're very involved in at BlackRock is alternative investments.
Yes.
The private markets,
yes.
Credit, debt, things like that. Should we be changing the rules so we can put our 401ks or our IRAs into private markets?
I believe there are some great areas of private markets that are going to be great investments for retirement. And I would channel that more towards infrastructure, because infrastructure has a long maturity. It has a higher coupon, but it has a lower profile of returns than what I would say other areas of the private markets. So it has a good corridor of returns, but higher probabilities of meeting those returns. And so, yes, we need to be re-looking at how we think about investing, whether that is going to be in private equity or infrastructure. I do believe, we need to be putting more long-dated assets into retirement, and so that you could meet the returns that you need to have the pool of money that you require during retirement.
Something else you mentioned was our longevity, which has increased substantially. We all benefit from that. That's a good thing. Exactly. I'm not complaining. At the same time, should we be encouraging, as you suggest in your letter, people working longer? Should we make it possible, facilitating? Should we, frankly, increase the age for Social Security?
That is not for me to make a decision, but I think we need to have a conversation. Look, you and I are the same age. Okay, we are working longer. We find purpose in what we do. The founder of Bloomberg, Mike, is still working. I believe for those who can and they find purpose in work, my gosh, work as long as you can. If you find blessings, if you find purpose in other things, do that. But I do believe we need to discuss these opportunities. I don't think the average citizen knows the extent of how much longer we're going to be able to live. So the beauty and the miracles of medicine has allowed us to live 10, 15, 20 years longer than 2 generations ago. And so, but we haven't changed our system of retirement or our system of Social Security. So the most important thing we need to do, David, is have a conversation. And through that conversation, I think most people are going to elect to do things, maybe working longer, or electing to be more involved in how they put their money to work for retirement.
As I say in your letter, you talk a lot about the success of the capital markets, all that they've accomplished. At the same time, you do mention the problem with particularly U.S. debt. You think it's more urgent than any time I think you said you can remember in your lifetime. Put those two things together. To what extent has the success of the capital markets come specifically because we've taken more debt on the public balance sheet? We've shifted debt from private balance sheets to public balance sheets.
No question. Let's just use a statistic, and I think when I talk about this statistic, I get frightened. In the year 2000, the U.S. deficit was $8 trillion. Today, it's $34 trillion. So 23 years later, we increased our deficit by $26 trillion. So for the first 40 years, we increased our deficit to $8 trillion, and in the last 23 years, we increased it by $26 trillion. I think that speaks volumes of what's happening in our country today. The problem with these type of deficits is, and now and I believe higher interest rates for longer, the cost of financing our deficits are going to erode more and more of our disposable income as a country. And I do believe we're getting to a point where our public debt is going to start crowding out private capital, and we're going to have structurally higher interest rates.
What can the private sector do to trigger some action in that regard? I mean, you're the head of the largest asset manager in the world, Larry Fink. It's not just you, but you have some influence. At this point, we have candidates running for president who aren't even talking about this subject.
It's not even a conversation. So in my letter, I talk about the need for more public-private investments. Well, the United States is one of the last countries where we've had private capital investing in our infrastructure. And I believe if we changed our policies, privatized our airports, and privatized maybe our ports, and having private capital investing that, then our public spending could be rededicated to more urgent social needs, more urgent needs, elevating our education, elevating, our issues around Social Security and healthcare. And so I believe the need is to rethink what is the role and responsibility of the public sector for the development of better 21st century infrastructure. We know that we are going to have to digitize our entire economy. We know we're going to have to move forward on decarbonization. These require huge pools of money. Allow the private sector to be part of that. We have this enormous functional capital markets that can provide the capital. We as a country must use it more often and access the role of private sector. And so I think we still, that does not change the course of our deficits, but we can certainly reallocate some of our monies into more urgent issues. And I would say, and my letter speaks about it, we need to grow our economy so our deficits are a smaller component of our GDP. That is the bigger issue. If we continue to just grow at 2% and we have these type of deficits, that's when the deficits really are going to be a problem out 5 and 10 years.
But you suggest 3%. Is that realistic?
That has to be our target. We need to find ways of growing at 3% instead of just cutting taxes, or we need to find ways of incenting private capital to be investing more. We need to encourage growth. And we need to be, and this is a debate now, and there's a lot of people talking against this, we need to embrace our capitalism, because our capitalism has shown to be the best economic force in the world.
And finally, Larry, let's go back to the personal here for a moment.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, you and I happen to be exactly the same age.
Right.
We're boomers.
Yes.
We have some responsibility to the succeeding generations that I'm not sure we're delivering on. How much of your letter was really saying to us boomers, we owe it to our children and our grandchildren to get our arms around these problems?
When we were born at a great economic moment, we all have a responsibility to try to recreate that environment for our grandchildren and hopefully make a better outcome for our children. But now, at our age, we've got to be focused on the future for our grandchildren.
Okay, Larry, thank you so much. Really great to have you here. That's Larry Fink. He's BlackRock Chairman and CEO. Joe, back to you.
David Weston, thank you. A fascinating conversation, having read Mr. Fink's letter this morning, and something that we were looking forward to, recalling the conversation that we were having here in Washington about the retirement age just days ago. And I want to hear from the panel on this. Rick Davis is with us here, along with Brad Howard, as we dig into the politics of this, recalling the conversation about Social Security in the budget that emerged, Rick Davis, from the Republican Study Committee. Highly controversial. It actually addressed the issue and recommended increasing the age for retirement. This is something that neither presidential candidate will touch right now. We're going back to the old lockbox here. Is it time to start having this conversation out loud?
Well, you kind of started that conversation at the presidential level when you interviewed Nikki Haley this primary cycle and got her talking about Social Security. And the bottom line is, I think what Larry Fink points out is just a fact. Americans are living longer. We're being more productive in that old age. Medicine has given us, a new chance to extend our lives. And yet public policy isn't following any of that. And as you point out, Rick Scott in the Republican Study Committee and Nikki Haley have said something about needing to reform Social Security. It is on the brink of being a financial disaster. And yet presidential candidates, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, seem to feel like it's some kind of toxic third rail that you can't talk about in politics. And, you'd be a disaster if you did. And I think Americans are more sophisticated than that. And I think a national dialogue is exactly what Larry Fink is calling for, and I think it's a smart move on his part.
With the Democratic view, Brad Howard, in our remaining moment in this conversation. Brad, we've got an 81-year-old president. All we do is talk about age around here in Washington, D.C. How come we can't have this conversation?
Well, look, the criticism isn't that we're having the conversation. The criticism is that the Republican proposal immediately makes seniors bear the burden of the bad decisions of Washington. And I think Democrats are going to look at it more holistically. Like there's ways you can tax the wealthier to help ensure the longevity of the Social Security Trust Fund. There's other mechanisms like why are millionaires and billionaires getting Social Security benefits? Those are questions that Democrats are asking. So I think I know the criticism is that they're looking at it from this angle. But let me say, like, there was a strong momentum behind a bipartisan national commission that would look at the nation's debt, including entitlement spending, which is Social Security and Medicare. It made it through, it was the Scott Peters bill. It made it through the Budget Committee on a bipartisan vote. And Democrats were willing to go forward with this. Who killed it was Grover Norquist and the Americans for Tax Reform, because they left on the table the idea of raising taxes to help ensure the longevity of Social Security. So, you know, both sides are to blame here. But again, the criticism is not that they're bringing it up. The criticism is their proposal to do so.
Brad Howard and Rick Davis, our great panel today. We'll have more with our panel straight ahead. Live from Washington, we'll also get an update from Bloomberg's Kaylee Lines. My partner is in the field today. She's in Baltimore where the bridge collapse took place, and we'll hear from her as well. Much more on the fastest show in politics. This is Bloomberg.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. The advance for the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ Composite Index approaching 10% for the year. After a two-day pullback, stocks today, they're advancing. The NASDAQ could be on track for another record close. Best performing stock in the S&P 500 right now. That belongs to McCormick. Those shares up about 11% after delivering an encouraging sales update. Worst performing stock is United Parcel Service. Those shares, they were down about 6.7%. Their revenue target beat estimates, but Wall Street analysts were pretty much underwhelmed by the results of the company. Ernie Thrasher, the chief executive officer of X-Coal Energy and Resources, says the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge that we've been covering likely to shut down coal exports for as many as 6 weeks, block the transport of up to 2.5 million tons of coal. And that is just one industry that is affected by this. And then you have Trump Media and Technology Group. Those shares 45% higher the first day of trading on the NASDAQ. Betting against the former president's social media startup, one of the most difficult and expensive short trades right now in the market. This according to the financial and the analytics firm S3 Partners. Investors tempted to bet against Trump Media and Technology Group, facing annual financing costs to borrow the shares of more than 150%. Right now, the overall market, S&P 500, up by about 10 points, a rise of 0.2%, 52.27 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 78 points. That's a rise of 0.2%. We're 39,391. And the NASDAQ Composite Index, 39 points higher. That is up about 0.25%. As we look at treasuries right now, the 2-year yield up 1 basis point. That's at 4.59. The benchmark 10-year yield unchanged at 4.23. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Balance of Power with Joe Matthew continues right now.
John Tucker, thank you. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington here on Balance of Power with an eye on Baltimore today. Of course, so many of us woke up to news of the bridge collapse. It took place around 1:30 this morning. The Dolly, the name of the ship, was on its way to Sri Lanka. It did not get out of Maryland. Of course, it hit the bridge, the Francis Scott Key Bridge, which is a roughly 1.5 mile long span and is now largely underwater. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV, showing you video of that bridge coming down this morning, remarkable. It doesn't even look real, as this took place so quickly after the Dolly lost power and slammed into a pylon on that bridge, taking the entire thing down. It is worth noting that Governor Wes Moore, in a news briefing this morning, made clear that bridge was up to code. This may not be an infrastructure story, even if it does lead to another conversation about infrastructure and our bridges around the country that are not up to code. But this is still a search and rescue operation. They're searching for 6 souls still missing. And my partner, Kaylee Lines, from Balance of Power here, has made her way up to Baltimore to the scene of that bridge collapse and joins us now with the latest. Kaylee, what can you tell us?
Well, Joe, this search and rescue effort is still very much underway, and that remains the priority. If you listen to American officials, including Governor Wes Moore, saving lives is their exclusive priority right now, they said. And of course, that effort is underway. There are still first responders transiting the area. We've seen some equipment and trucks and things like trailers moving up toward the remaining parts of this thoroughfare. But of course, as you say, Joe, pretty much the entire bridge is now underwater. Of course, that is what they're dealing with most immediately. But then we have to think about what comes next. We, of course, heard from President Biden just over an hour ago talking about how he would like the federal government to provide the funding to reconstruct this bridge. The timeline under which that may happen, though, very much in question. The governor certainly did not put a timeline on the reconstruction of the bridge or the reopening of the port of Baltimore when he spoke earlier today. A lot remains uncertain at this hour. What we do know, though, is that companies already who have been using this to get goods in and out for exports and imports already are thinking about diverting those cargoes, be it autos or coal, around the port of Baltimore to other ports like New York in the north or Norfolk and Virginia to the south.
Yeah, we heard Kaylee from the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, knowing that there's going to be massive overflow here as some ships steer around the port and others try to find new areas of access on the East Coast. very clearly, the Port of New York and New Jersey is proactively working with our industry partners, it says, to respond as needed and ensure supply chain continuity along the East Coast. Kaylee, we've learned a lot about that bridge today and a lot about the Port of Baltimore, the largest port in the country for autos and also an extremely important artery for coal. We were just hearing from John Tucker that coal shipments could be shut down for as many as 6 weeks. The economic impact here could be huge.
Yeah, Joe, that's absolutely right. We were talking about millions of tons of coal that was exported from the Port of Baltimore last year. Actually, in 2022, it represented about a fifth of exports in total being handled by this port. So that's just one example of an industry that could be very much disrupted by today's events. Autos, as you mentioned, another. For 13 years in a row, the Port of Baltimore has handled the most in terms of the numbers of cars and light trucks being handled by any port. It was near 850,000 vehicles last year. So already Ford, General Motors talking about diverting those transits to other ports, like we've mentioned. The port authorities in New Jersey and New York, for example, could be getting prepared to handle those extra cargoes, work on their capacity. But of course, Joe, it also raises questions considering this is effectively a road, a transit on I-695 that has been disrupted, about ground transport as well. We heard from a trucking association earlier that said 4,900 trucks, commercial trucks per day cross this bridge. And that's not even considering the 35,000 commuter vehicles that crossed it daily, about 11 million vehicles a year in total. And it's going to create some serious gridlock as cargoes have to be diverted, trucks have to be diverted, and commuters have to find other ways to get around the state of Maryland and the surrounding areas, keeping in mind that anything hazardous material cannot go through the tunnels. So we're talking for anything carrying hazardous material, potentially 30 miles being added to the journey because they can no longer go over this key bridge that has collapsed.
Just great information, Kaylee. We're lucky to have you there. Bloomberg's Kaylee Lines with us live from Baltimore, where the bridge collapsed this morning. And Kaylee is right, 695. This is a very important road. It's not just the bridge itself. That highway actually comes right down here to Washington, which is why I drive on 695 to get to work every day. Let's reassemble our panel now. Rick Davis is with us, along with Brad Howard, as we try to get to the politics of this as well. And Brad, a test for any elected official who is involved here. We heard a short time ago from Joe Biden. He spoke from the White House pledging, as Kaylee mentioned, that the federal government will pay the entire cost of rebuilding that bridge. But beyond Joe Biden, you've got a young governor named Wes Moore. You've got lawmakers, of course, in Baltimore. All of them will be tested by the outcome. And when you look at this, you were a chief of staff lawmaker for many years on Capitol Hill. It is the scenarios that you cannot plan for that test you in times like these, aren't they?
Absolutely. This is where relationships matter. And I was chief of staff to a Florida member who, as you know, is state prone to natural disasters. And I worked for the mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Langer, which is, obviously got its own infrastructure problems. And Mitch Langer was the infrastructure kind of director under Pete Buttigieg and recently left the administration. So a lot of experience in this area. But yes, this is when relationships matter. And in particular, the Maryland congressional delegation is very close to Congress and the federal bureaucracy and red tape that are in D.C. because a lot of their constituents work in these buildings and probably use this bridge. So you've got to think that there's going to be a lot of incentive to fix this. And again, not to emphasize the consequences of this event, but it's not just the vehicular and truck traffic. These ships can now not pass through the Port of New Orleans until the harbor is cleaned up. That's going to take weeks, and I can't stress the stress that's going to put on supply chain and pricing, et cetera. So this is a really, really big deal that's going to impact a lot of Americans, not just those that use the bridge.
The Port of Baltimore, of course, that we're talking about here. Rick, you've spent a career preparing politicians for any number of scenarios that would be unnatural for most of us, whether it was an elected official or a politician running a political campaign, running for election. How do you prepare an elected official for something like this?
It'll be interesting to see how all this shapes up politically. Obviously, it's a hugely important infrastructure hub of any kind, right? Whether it's the cars going across the bridge or the access to the port, the development that goes on in that region. And you kind of feel for Baltimore, they've had a tough run of it. And I think they were just really getting some growth this last couple of years, and then something like this hits them. I'm looking at this Maryland Senate race. We have a very interesting situation where, former Governor Larry Hogan has entered into the race. Would have been a no-brainer Democratic pickup hold for this cycle, but all indications are that Hogan's currently leading in a pack. There's a tough Democratic primary, and I wonder if Maryland voters are going to look at this and say, gee, maybe it'd be actually a good thing to have a Republican in the Senate to help us plead our case, since we already have a Democrat representing us. And so you wonder, can something like this, well past today, well past the search and rescue, which is the priority now, it's not about politics, but when you start thinking about it later on in the year, you wonder whether or not this is something that could drive some votes in Maryland.
As soon as you say that, David Trone on Twitter here, of course, he's in the primary for that Senate race. Thank you to the officials who acted swiftly to stop new traffic on Key Bridge after receiving the Mayday call this morning. So much of this is perception. Brad, I just want to give you a chance to weigh in. We have less than a minute here at this point. How do candidates like a Democrat, in the case of David Trone, push back on that perception?
Well, I think you've got to be careful when you're a candidate and not a current office holder, because by nature of that position, anything you do is political in nature. And so you want to be careful that your focus remains on the search and rescue with the families that are affected by this, and that you're pledging all these senses you can. But again, you can stress what you would do when you get there, but it's a very careful situation here. And I'll add too that Larry Hogan is leading in the polls at the moment, but I suspect that's because he's a two-term governor who's got a high name ID. I think once the Democrats emerge with their nominee, Maryland is by nature a solid blue state. And if Joe Biden and the new governor there in Maryland, Westmore, who I think is a contender for the Democratic nomination one day for president, really work well together, I think they're going to show that Democrats can govern, and that's probably going to help the Democratic case and hurt Larry Hogan in the long term. But a lot of this is very early on. We're just, we're handicapping a race that hasn't quite started yet.
You said it.
We'll see how this emerges.
Absolutely. Brad and Rick, I can't thank you enough for being with us today, dealing with breaking news and some very challenging subject matter with such grace. You always help us understand what's happening in the heat of the moment. Rick Davis and Brad Howard, our political panel today. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We'll bring you back, of course, to Baltimore a bit later this hour. We'll connect with Kaylee to see what's happening there, and a conversation with Morning Consult about the latest Bloomberg swing state poll. That's next after we check world and national news with Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Hey, Joe. President Biden is promising Baltimore the government will not abandon the city as it tries to recover from today's collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge. It was destroyed after a Immerse container ship ran into one of the support pillars.
It's my intention that the federal government will pay for the entire cost of reconstructing that bridge, and I expect the Congress to support my effort. This is going to take some time. The people of Baltimore can count on us, though, to stick with them at every step of the way.
Maryland officials say they know of at least 6 construction workers who are missing following the collapse of the bridge early this morning. One person did walk away while another person was taken to the hospital. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it. With Bloomberg News Now, I'm Nancy Lyons.
My general advice is continue to seek out companies or people that are maybe one stage or two stage ahead of you. And I think this is generalizable to not just to startups, but anyone seeking fast growth in their own professional lives, in their careers too. What does greatness look like? Try to seek out people who've been there, done that before, and then try to not connect with one, but try to interview 3, 5, 10 people to see what is a general pattern of greatness that look like that will get you to the next level of the company, next stage, maybe a year, 12 months from now, 24 months from now. Seek out people who kind of went down that path a few times. Then you'll start to find this pattern that start to emerge. What are things that you need to have 12 months from now, 24 months from now that you currently don't have? Then try to like build a path towards that. It's almost like Amazon's or Jeff Bezos' mantra of working backwards. Think about what your end game or next stage look like, and then figure out your steps to getting there, and who do you need to work with, upgrading or coaching your existing team or recruiting from somewhere else to really level your leadership. Because ultimately, the job of a CEO is to do 3 things, right? One is get the strategy right for your company, making sure it's executed, get the right teams onboarded, getting the resources, whether it be fundraising or allocating your resources. So it's strategy, people, or team, figuring out how you need to navigate those things to get to the next level.
When I was younger, I used to be in bands. I'd play drums in bands and toured America with them. Did a lot of session drumming, recorded albums. So yeah, it was good fun doing the drumming. The only reason I stopped it, well, I still play, but not as serious as I did when I was younger. But drumming doesn't pay the bills. I was never good enough to be able to pay the bills with it, but it was good fun. I started RJF, and the reason I started it was I saw a gap in the market for particular early stage and startup businesses. With the experience that I've got of running businesses, of being a finance director at the very biggest companies in the world to being finance director of small startups, we were looking at providing more than just basic accountancy services. So yes, we'll do all that. We'll do all the basic, all the statutory side of things that you need to do. But there's so much more value that we can add, and I wanted to have my experience to help these startups, because a lot of them don't really know where to go. You can go to your high street accountants and they can do a good job compliance-wise, but you would question whether they've actually been in the fire line of a business. Have you been in a business where you're thinking, how do I pay wages next week? Or business is really successful, what do we do with it next? Or how do we grow it? How do we grow into international territories? Or how do we grow our markets? How do we expand? So a lot of the experience I've seen over the years and seen different types of business in different sectors, I thought, well, it's a real value that I can add to these businesses as opposed to just being an FD, because a lot of these businesses can't afford an FD. But if we can take care of their statutory side of things, the compliance side of things, I'm on hand to be able to help and advise businesses with their growth strategy, or if they're in difficulty, help them through these times.
The shipping line is liable in this case after the dolly lost power. That cargo ship and slammed into the bridge, bringing it down. Most of that bridge is underwater right now, and Kaylee joins us from the scene. Kaylee, we understand the Transportation Secretary is on his way there today.
Yes, we do expect, Joe, that Secretary Buttigieg will be coming here to view the scene, to partake in the efforts, which of course right now is still a search and rescue effort as we speak, at the invitation of Governor Wes Moore. We have not yet seen the Secretary arrive, but of course we'll keep all on Bloomberg Television and Radio posted as we do have developments here. And of course he will likely reiterate what we have heard, as you said, from the president, that the federal government is going to be leading this effort in terms of financing the reconstruction of this bridge. Of course, that could be a figure in the billions of dollars potentially. quickly. And of course, before any reconstruction effort can be underway, they do have to clear out just the debris that is currently in the river behind me, keeping in mind that basically the entirety of this bridge collapsed and started to be at least partially submerged. It is going to take some time to get all of that out, to clear out the waterway, not just so the bridge can be reconstructed or that project can begin, but also so that the port can be reopened and that ships can transit this waterway once again. It's worth keeping in mind here as we think about the timeline, which could be potentially very long. Governor Moore talked about it being a long-haul project earlier this morning at a press conference, but also the question of how quickly this financing can be secured. When President Biden said he does intend for the federal government to pick up the tab on this, he said that he does expect Congress will approve that, but we know that this president hasn't had an immense degree of ease in asking Congress for money and that passing in an expeditious manner, Joe. We all know what just happened with government funding. Of course, there was a supplemental request including emergency aid for U.S. allies like Ukraine and Israel that still hasn't been acted on by the House. So we'll see just how quickly it can work its way through the workings of the federal government as state officials are responding here in real time today.
That's for sure. Kaylee, we're really glad that you could get there and bring this information to us. Thank you for being at the scene. You'll be hearing from Kaylee, of course, throughout the day here on Bloomberg Radio and TV, my partner here on Balance of Power, doing the good work that you're hearing. We started our broadcast talking with Amy Morris from Bloomberg Radio, who really brought home the impact that this has on a local level. We're going to talk a lot in the days and weeks ahead about the national impact, maybe even international economic impact on trade. The biggest port in America for autos, the 9th largest overall. Coal shipments being brought to a standstill now for some 6 weeks. But if you live in the Baltimore area, this is your home. It's actually known, or was, as the Golden Gate Bridge of Baltimore. It was part of the skyline there, and this is something that is hitting the community hard. We're actually hearing now from the sports teams in Baltimore. The Orioles out with a statement that says, in part, Baltimore, we're a tight-knit and resilient city. Together, we will get through this. The Baltimore Ravens, similar. We know that the Baltimore community will stand together in the aftermath of this tragic event. We'll have a lot more for you on the later edition of Balance of Power. It starts at 5 p.m. Washington time here on Bloomberg TV and radio, and a conversation with former Transportation Secretary Ray LaHood, among others, who will join us to talk about the impact and the recovery here on a day that we would typically be leading with the new Bloomberg swing state poll. We got new numbers out this morning. There has been so much breaking news so far today, I haven't had a chance to get to it until now. And as we heard from Joe Biden ahead of his trip to North Carolina, the news is quite good for him. The blue wall we talk so much about may in fact be in place for him by the time we vote, if the trajectory remains intact in the polling that we've seen. Bloomberg, of course, working with Morning Consult on this, on the monthly. This has been a rolling poll, if you will, or a monthly poll that we've been updating in the 7 swing states that will likely decide the election, will likely pick the next president of the United States. The headline on the terminal: Biden erases Trump's lead in blue wall states he needs to win. And to that end, we bring in Eli Yokley, U.S. politics analyst at Morning Consult, our partners on this poll. Eli, it's great to see you back. Where is Joe Biden making headway?
Things are looking a little better for President Biden. Since we last checked in on this, Joe Biden has improved his standing in Michigan, a very key state to his reelection. He's made improvements in Nevada and in North Carolina and in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. Look, he's above water for the first time in our survey since October in Wisconsin. This is positive forward movement. But look, he still faces a very tough electorate this year. We've seen some signs of improvement in terms of the favorability rating, how folks are thinking about the economy, the kind of news voters are taking away about the president. But in a number of these states, he's still trailing President Trump.
And to be tied in Pennsylvania, let's be honest, Eli, this is home for Joe Biden. He's been to that state, I think, more than any other since he's been in office. He went up there to drop his budget. He's delivered some very important speeches. He calls Scranton home, whether you buy into that narrative in the biography. Is that the first place the campaign needs to get to work?
I mean, he spent a tremendous amount of time there. It's like a running joke that he goes there every month. He goes there a lot. It's an important state for him. It's an important state for Democrats. I think one thing that he's going to need to lean into there is convincing voters that the economy at the local level has actually improved. It's one of the worst states right now. We saw a trend across all of these states we tested where economic sentiment, the way people are thinking about the direction of the economy has gone on the rise across the swing state map. And it's been driven by perceptions of their local economy. Pennsylvania is one of the states where that is still underwater. The president has an opportunity here to try to make that case, but right now it's not breaking through to the same extent that it is in places like Wisconsin, where he finally has a lead over Trump.
Something to be said about peaking late in this game, Eli. If you're Joe Biden and you're looking out across the next 8 months here, you see people feeling better about the economy now, knowing that interest rates might be coming, knowing that you have twice as much cash on hand as Donald Trump. When you look to, I guess, across the valley here to November, if you're this campaign, do you not see the stars aligning?
I think that it's early in this campaign. I mean, a good chunk of voters a couple of months ago didn't even think that Donald Trump would be the nominee, or they weren't so sure. A number of voters still say that. The American people are not paying attention to this, or at least hadn't been paying attention to this, to the extent that Washington is. I think we're seeing signs that more voters are paying attention. I think that folks are taking note of, as Biden would cast it, the threat of another Trump presidency. That is something that he's going to need to rely on very, very heavily to try to rebuild that anti-Trump coalition that got him the White House in the first place. It wasn't really a pro-Biden coalition that got him across the finish line 4 years ago. It was an anti-Trump coalition. And you're starting to see signs in places like Wisconsin that is materializing. Some of this is driven by independent voters who are far more likely to cast their vote, if they're supporting Joe Biden, as a vote against Donald Trump than a vote for the incumbent. This negative energy activates folks, and the Biden campaign is going to need to spend a lot of time in the coming months to try to revive that as it builds up perceptions of its own handling of the presidency.
Spending time with Eli Yoakley at Morning Consult. Eli, I'm really struck by something that everyone seems to agree on here, progressives as well as Donald Trump supporters. Eat the rich. This is something that came out of the poll here. Those 69%, those you polled in 7 swing states, favor higher taxes on billionaires, even Americans making over $400,000 a year. What else can you tell us about this?
Yeah, it turns out that the vast majority of the American people like taxing the rich. It's very popular. And by the way, it's very popular among Trump supporters, too. I mean, over half of Donald Trump supporters support taxing people who make over $400,000. A good number of them, about a third, which is a lot of Republicans, support raising taxes on corporations. This is the two major parties maybe finding a place of agreement on a populist policy, which is maybe the American people think the rich are making too much money right now. We saw some of this emerge during the inflation discussion early in Biden's presidency, where a lot of voters were blaming corporations for being greedy.
Yeah.
I think this is an underlying current in American politics that Donald Trump has had a lot of luck allowing the Republican Party to tap into. It's where I think people normally are with the Democratic Party. But if you could see if he moves forward in this campaign and maybe try to offer some compromises to restore his 2015 tax cuts for all Americans, maybe a place of possible common ground in the next presidency.
Well, how does that help Trump, though? This is the man behind the 2017 tax cuts. He's a billionaire. This is actually what we're talking about. He wants to lower the corporate tax rate, doesn't he?
Yeah, I think it helps Trump in the sense that a good number of people associate the Republican Party more with people like them than they did before he took over. He is rebuilding a populist, regardless of his wealth and his billionaire status. He has helped rebuild the Republican Party's brand as a party that cares more about everyday Americans. The other thing that stands out in this, by the way, is the American people seem inclined to be on board with some of his tariff discussion. He's talked a lot about raising tariffs on some foreign imports. The American people seem to be there. That seems like something that might raise costs for everyday folks, but this going after big business is more protectionist bent in America, this populist bent in American politics is something that is becoming a bit of a unifier this year.
That's pretty remarkable. I guess the populist election, even if it doesn't always agree with one candidate or the other, you go with the message. Eli, we've been talking a lot about third parties lately. No Labels is scratching, looking for a candidate here. RFK Jr. is trying to make news. He put up a running mate today, even though he's only on a couple of ballots. Is this going to be a factor in polling and actual election results in November?
I mean, some of these states are so close. I mean, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin are tight races. A couple points here and there matter a lot. I think what stood out in this latest survey is that RFK does pull from President Biden, along with folks like Cornel West and Jill Stein. It's going to be something to watch. I mean, RFK keeps getting more popular in all of these surveys. There's not been much of an effort against him yet, and we're still going to see what kind of ballots he can get on. But, you know, the presence of some of these third-party candidates, especially when so many voters dislike both of the major party candidates, is obviously something that both sides need to watch. And right now it does appear to be a bit of a challenge for President Biden.
Fascinating stuff here. With so much time left, Eli, you know, we started this campaign cycle warning everybody, don't read into national polls too much here. There's too much time to go. And this poll really seems to underscore that argument. If you're not looking specifically at Wisconsin, if you're not looking specifically at Pennsylvania, for instance, these are two that we've really isolated in our conversation here, you have no idea what's going on in this campaign.
Yep. I mean, we always think of our national surveys as a leading indicator. I mean, we saw some of this in the national data we collected after the State of the Union, that fewer voters were concerned about the president's age. Since Donald Trump won the Super Tuesday contest, we started to see this race solidify in a very tight way. But the importance of what we're doing every single month helps explain to the American people what's happening on the ground in some of these key states and pick up some of these small movements. They're going to matter a lot come November.
Are we going to be talking about a blue wall in November?
We're always talking about a blue wall. We'll be talking about a blue wall. We'll be talking about Arizona. We've already heard folks start talking about North Carolina. We'll see how that pans out. Yeah. But it does appear that, you know, places like Wisconsin and Michigan are going to be a big deal come November.
Glad you could come on today, Eli. Another poll in the bag. We'll talk to you in about a month. Eli Oakley, political analyst at Morning Consult, our partners here on the Bloomberg News Swing State Poll. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Just about time to hand the baton to New York. Tim Stenivek, Carol Master standing by on Bloomberg Business Week. In the fishbowl, Tim Stenivek, this is really something. Oh, I hear Carol too, I think. Hey, you guys, what do you have coming up today? We've been talking about bridges and the Bloomberg poll for the last 2 hours.
Yeah, the bridge, certainly our top story, the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore. We're going to have the latest there. We're going to go to Kaylee Lyons for an update in just a few minutes. Also, talking about the former president's SPAC going public today, first day of trading, what it means for Donald Trump and all that trading, too.
Huge week for Trump. By the way, Kaylee has been a rock star in Baltimore. I'll be watching and listening, and we'll see you guys at 5 on Balance of Power. Bloomberg Business Week starts now.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody. Live on Bloomberg Radio and television, on YouTube and Bloomberg Originals. I'm Carol Masser along with Tim Stenivek, live on this Tuesday, March 26th. Let's get to the setup. And of course, as you know, our top story at this hour, the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore collapsing. We will have the latest on that and what we need to know about this tragedy, and also really kind of looking at it, obviously, the people first and foremost, but also in terms of what it means as it being one of the most significant ports here in the United States, the impact on supply chains and more.
Yeah, we're hitting it from all angles this afternoon. Plus, the former president, Donald Trump, back in the news again. This time, it's for his social media startup that began trading today as a publicly held company. We're going to look into the trade and also into the company's balance sheet.
Yeah, both of these among, of course, are most read on the Bloomberg today. Also, we're going to hear from BlackRock CEO Larry Fink. He's out with his annual letter, so a couple of things to get to, wide and macro, but he definitely covers things that will resonate with investors.
Hey, plus as gold climbs toward a record, we're going to check in on gold and other precious metals. We do that with Chris Gaffney, president of World Markets over at Everbank.
All right, folks, let's get you going, though, on this Tuesday with a check of your top business stories and a look at that trade. Here is John Tucker.
Yeah, Carol and Tim, quarter in positioning driving stocks today. They're bouncing back, and since the start of the year, S&P 500, NASDAQ up close to 10% now. Traders gearing up for the Fed's preferred inflation gauge. We get that on Friday. Also parsing the latest economic readings today. Consumer confidence holding steady. Durable goods orders climbing. Home price growth accelerating at the fastest rate since 2022. You mentioned it. Trump Media and Technology Group shares up 49%. First day of trading on the NASDAQ. Also becoming the most expensive stock to short, given so many people want to bet against it. S&P 500 up 9 points, 52.27 on the index. The Dow up 78 points. The NASDAQ 100 right now 38 points higher. That is a rise of 0.2%. And we check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Carol and Tim.
All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. All right, that's your market setup on this Tuesday. Let's get to what, as you know, is our top national story. The collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore after a container ship struck it, sending nearly the entire roadway structure crumbling into the water. President Biden addressing the incident earlier from the White House.
I told them we're going to send all the federal resources they need as we respond to this emergency.